Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that we're in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Our drinking water comes from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation in Treaty 3 territory. My name is Lynn Nesbitt, and I'm chairing today's panel. Joining me on the panel are Jerry Arnell and Valerie Werhun. Our assessor today is Alyssa Edarkanova, and our administrative personnel is Twinkle Sharma. We'll be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that are made at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by Council and is independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the Board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of King's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the Board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I'll confirm the points of appeal with your property to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony, followed by questions that the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all of the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the Board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You will receive the Board's decision by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. We will be hearing items 1 and 5 through 8 on our docket today. Ms. Sharma, please affirm the assessor's and applicant's testimony.
For sure. Ms. Assessor, please state your full name.
Hanova.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to provide at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Mr. Applicant, please state your full name.
Slaughter.
Do you affirm that the evidence you're about to provide at this hearing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So let's just jump right into our agenda today with item number 1. This is file number 24-1501, 550 Gertrude Avenue. Ms. Assessor.
File number is 24-1501. Roll number is 120217810000. This is 550 Gertrude Avenue. Owner is Mark A. Mazur and Stephen A. Mazur. Roll year is 2025 with the reference date being April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is $1,147,000. This is Res 2 and taxable. The apartment has 1 building on site, which is 3 stories, and the actual year built and effective year built are both 1960. There are 15 suites and 12 outdoor parking. Continuing to page 2, there's a 2018 sale between related parties. Continuing to page 3, we have the income value summary. So we have 12 one-bedrooms and 3 two-bedrooms, totaling our 15, and the average monthly rent per unit is $726.02. The model generated assessment below. Gross potential rent, 130,684 with a vacancy rate of 3.2 applied. The effective gross income is 126,502, and the expense rate here is 55.10%. The net operating income is 56,799, which is in line with the 2022 INE info that we have. The cap rate is 4.95, and the estimated market value is 1,147,000. Market value per suite is 76,466. Going to page 4, we have our rent comparables. So all our apartments, stories for the comparables are 2 stories. And we have a year range from 1955 to 1959. Primarily, the comparables consist of 1-bedroom suites for the mix, with 1 and 3 having some 2 bedrooms included as well. The gross floor area per unit for the subject is 823 square foot, and for the comparables, it ranges from 729 square feet to 845 square feet. The average monthly rent per unit for the comparables ranges from 688 to 933. So we can see that the subject falls within the range. On to page 5, we have our cap rate evidence. The following is a sample of actual sales that took place during the reference period. The purpose for showing these individual capitalization rates is to illustrate the accuracy of the model and substantiate the model-derived capitalization rates. They are not meant to be comparable specific to the subject property. Net operating income has been developed through stabilizing owner-reported income and expense information. Capitalization rates have been derived by dividing the property's net operating income by its sale price. So we can see here in the table that there is a cap rate range from 3.46 to 5.74. Continuing to page 6, you have some more cap rate evidence. So looking at the City of Winnipeg column for our 20th percentile and 80th percentile within the multifamily, we have 4.75 and 5.45. So we can see that the subject falls within the 80th percentile. Page 7 has the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. And page 8 shows an aerial view of the subject property highlighted in the purple rectangle box, and as well a map view showing that it's within the McMillan neighborhood, located to Osborne Village, Little Italy. Page 9, we have some Google Street View images from May 2023 of the subject. And page 10 shows the information submitted to us for the year 2022. So on line, or box, I should say, 9369, we can see here that the net income loss before adjustments is 57,761.66%. So it seems that the model is very well supported. That would conclude my presentation. I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Slaughter, questions for the assessor?
Yes, Madam Chair, I don't have any questions. We didn't submit evidence for this property because we didn't have sufficient information from the owner. So I'd actually just like to ask the board to confirm the assessment via section 54.1, if I may.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Slaughter.
Thank you.
I'll just ask panel members, Mr. Arnell or Ms. Werhan, do you have questions?
No questions, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
I do not, thank you.
Thank you. All right, thank you. That will conclude item 1. Okay, moving on then to item number 5. This is file number 24-2188, 114 River Avenue. Ms. Idarhonova, your evidence, please.
File number is 24-2188, roll number 120319561000. Address is 114 River Avenue. Owner is 5751111 Manitoba Limited. Roll year is 2025, with the reference date being April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is $1,193,000. This is Res 2 taxable. The apartment has one building on site, which is 2 stories, and the actual year built and effective year built are 1962. The number of suites here is 11, and the outdoor parking is 8. Continuing to page 3, we can see that the building consists of exclusively 11 one-bedrooms, and the average monthly rent per unit is $881.48. The model-derived assessment shows that the gross potential rent is $116,355 with a vacancy rate of 3.2 applied. The effective gross income is $112,632 with an expense rate of 48.64% applied. Expenses are $54,784, net operating income $57,848, and we have a cap rate here of 4.85. The estimated market value is $1,193,000, and the market value per suite is $108,454. Looking at our rent comparables, all our apartments, and we have primarily 2 stories, 1 3-story. The effective year built ranges from 1955 to 1965. We have an exclusive mix of 1-bedroom units here, and the gross floor area per unit for the subject is 794 square feet, and for the comparables, it ranges from 794 square feet to 851 square feet, and the average monthly rent per unit ranges from 905 to 1,018. Going to page 5, we have our capitalization rate evidence. The following is a sample of actual sales that took place during the reference period. The purpose for showing these individual capitalization rates is to illustrate the accuracy of the model and substantiate the model-derived capitalization rates. They are not meant to be comparable specific to the subject property. Net operating income has been developed through stabilizing owner-reported income and expense information. Capitalization rates have been derived by dividing the property's net operating income by its sale price, and we can see in the table that it ranges from 3.46 cap to 5.74 cap. Again, on page 6, we have more City of Winnipeg cap rate evidence. So looking at the multifamily, City of Winnipeg, 20th and 80th percentile, we have 4.75 cap and 5.45. So the subject falls within the range. And page 7, Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. Going to page 8, we have the aerial view for the subject property, as well as the map view highlighting the location close to downtown near Osborne Village. Page 9 shows some online information for subject property. The little blurb says, 114 River is a beautifully maintained 3-story apartment that features 1-bedroom suites with refinished hardwood, vinyl wood, flooring, modern ceiling fans, stainless steel appliances, including a dishwasher, new windows, blinds, and more. And then we have the images of the subject on pages 9, 10 as well. Looking at the 2022 mailer, we can see that The NOI is $65,408, which is, I guess, the model assessment comes in at 57,848 for that one. So it seems to be supported. That would conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Slaughter, questions for the assessor?
Yeah, just a few. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Ms. Adarkanova, just to confirm then, you went over the description of the property, but just to confirm, it's a 1962 walk-up on River Avenue, correct?
Correct.
And the number of stalls appear to be 8 for 11 suites. Is that correct?
That's
Less than a 1-to-1 ratio.
correct. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. If I could ask you to turn to page 5, please. So you had mentioned the city's capitalization rate conclusions derived. Is there any supporting documentation? Do we know how the NOIs were stabilized in these cases, or what factors were considered in the calculations?
Just the information that's presented here today in the table is what we have.
Okay, thank you. And so the conclusions appear to be a floor, a lowest cap rate as low as 3.46%. On page 4, you have a summary of the marketing reports for the brokers in Winnipeg.
On page
And if
4?
sorry, on page 6.
Okay.
Yeah, page 6, and down the chart, second from the bottom is the multifamily. And if we look to low rise, we see 3 broker reports, Colliers, CBRE, Cushman. And you'd agree that Colliers and Cushman, they have a floor of 5% up to a high of 6%. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. But the city's conclusions are as low as 3.46%.
Well, that would just be one example.
Mm-hmm.
We also have cap rates ranging up to 5.74.
And the applied cap rate for this property then is also below the floor that's reported by the brokers at 4.85%, correct?
Correct for Colliers and Cushman and Wakefield, but for the city fall within the parameters.
And one of the comparisons that you have on page 5 is on Corden Avenue. And that seems to indicate, according to the city, a 5.74% capitalization rate. Would you think that, based on location at least and age, suite count, I believe Corden has 2 bedrooms as well as 1, but otherwise that's probably the best comparison in those aspects. Would you agree?
Sorry, say that again.
As far as the location, the suite count, the age of the comparison shown, that might be the best comparison based on those factors. Would you agree?
It is, I guess, the most dated sale, 2018. So I don't think I would necessarily agree with that specifically, and that these the table is not meant to be comparable specific to the subject property. I'd like to reiterate that.
Yeah, I understand. It's hard to say that one property should be looked at. You should be looking at the evidence as a whole. So that's all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Slaughter. Mr. Arnell, questions for the assessor?
No, I don't have any questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Werhan?
I have none, thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's just on your capitalization rates as assessor, you are at the low end of the 20th to 80th percentile. So
Correct.
what drives the city's cap rates with respect to a multifamily residence? What factors?
There would be quality factors involved as well as variables that go into the data, such as the age, which year is 1962 for effective year. and I guess other property characteristics.
For example,
For example, the overall quality of the subject, the way that it's entered. I wouldn't know the specifics.
okay. What about suite count?
I wouldn't know for certainty.
Okay. Based on your experience, though, would a property with a small number of suites, similar to our subject, would it be considered a riskier investment or a not as risky investment? I'm just trying to get a sense of
Okay.
how the city treats these smaller types or views these
Typically,
smaller
the
types.
smaller apartments, they have, they're seen as less risky as they're more, I guess, viable to a larger pool of purchasers, perhaps, because a group of friends could invest on such a property, whereas a larger apartment building would be like more for more serious investors,
And
and
okay, go ahead. Sorry.
that would typically assume more risk as well.
Okay. Would this be considered an investment grade type of property?
I would think it would be one of the smaller ones, just considering it only has 11 units.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Mr. Slaughter.
Madam Chairman, if I could, first of all, we have two pieces of evidence, Madam Chair. We have the direct
Okay.
evidence on the property, and then there's a capitalization rate study.
Okay.
There's also some rebuttal evidence that I'll refer to.
Okay.
But I can maybe do that after the first two documents or
Yeah.
after questions, I guess.
Yes, let's go through your two pieces of main evidence, and I'm assuming your cap rate study will apply to the remainder of the docket as well.
Correct. Yeah.
So let's go through those first two pieces of evidence. We'll have questions and then we'll go to your rebuttal.
Thank you.
Okay.
We've gone through the property description. I don't need to reiterate too much. I'll just ask to start on page 6. And again, we have an aerial photograph of the property and a photograph of the property. And I think, step one is let's recognize what it is that we're valuing. It's a mid-century walk-up property with some of this, all one bedrooms, some of the suites on the lower level. So it's a 2.5 level property. I would suggest that this would not be considered an investment grade property. We then turn to our income approach on page 12. And I'll just summarize it like this. I think the assessor was correct that the model was a little low on the net income. So we've looked at the stabilized actual performance over 3 years, and we've applied a slightly higher revenue. We agree with the market vacancy allowance, and our expense ratio is a slight bit higher, but it's very close within range. We're at 50%, the city's at 48%. Again, we support our conclusions with a full stabilization, which we include on page 15. So in the end, Madam Chair, actually we're close, but maybe a little higher on the NOI than the city is. Yeah, about $4,000 higher. But of course, the main difference that we have is the capitalization rate. Before I ask the board to turn to the capitalization rate as a separate document, we've also on page 16 examined the repair and maintenance to the best of our abilities. Our team would obtain all the records that they could and try and, to the best of their ability, differentiate between what we'd consider capital and what we'd consider just regular R&M. And from that remainder amount of what we consider R&M, we then apply what we feel is an appropriate stabilized repair and maintenance per suite. In this case, we've applied $1,265 per suite. But what the exercise also allows us to do is to see if there's any significant improvements to the property as far as capital improvements, which we should recognize in the application of an appropriate capitalization rate. We look at the photographs that have been provided by the owner for marketing, and I describe this as an average one-bedroom apartment. So with that background, if I could ask the panel please to turn to our second document, which is Altus Group's capitalization rate study.
Yep.
Okay. I'll start by saying that this is my first time doing an apartment this round. So I've been having to catch up on a lot of the good work our team has done on this. But I know for a fact that everybody on this panel has heard our team talk about the cap rate study at length. So I will keep it brief. The starting point, well, actually, the starting point that our team takes, and this is universal for all of our capitalization rate studies, is we look to what is actually happening in the market of the economic factors that will influence capitalization rates as a whole. And if you were to break down the three main categories, of course, there's many, many subsets of factors that influence capitalization rates. But really, if you break down the categories to three umbrella categories, they are an investigation of supply demand in the market, a recognition of the ability or the likelihood of appreciation in rental income or net income for the property. And when I say that, one of the subsets of that is when you're looking at a property that has undergone significant improvements, and then there's an application to the RTB for a above guideline rent increase. Well, anybody valuing that particular property needs to recognize that in the determination of a capitalization rate, because at that moment, the purchaser is buying something different than the historical income. So it's the expectation of an appreciation of income. And then the third category is basically the cost of borrowing. So any investor, whether it be a small collection of private investors or a larger pension fund or REIT, has to recognize that the largest component of their investment will likely be on the debt side, and they have to factor in the cost of that debt into their equation. And appraisers will often exercise this through what's called a band of investment technique, where they look at what a typical rate of return on equity is and what the typical cost of borrowing is, and there's a mathematical calculation to bring the two together into a capitalization rate. But the main principle that we need to recognize is if the cost of borrowing goes up, the capitalization rates typically, and now this isn't universal, it all depends on the asset class and the other factors, but that certainly is one thing that's going to be influencing capitalization rates upwards. And what we've had happen since the late teens and into the pandemic years is that interest rates, which had been going down and down and down and compressing, and then compressed down to almost zero because of the pandemic. Well, through 2022, they started to shoot back up again. And we have in our evidence, I think a very telling graph is on page 7, which shows the Bank of Canada rate going up approximately 400 basis points. And then one says, well, what does that mean for cap rates? Well, as the Bank of Canada rate goes up, banks start charging more for their lending rates. We see that on page 8, lending rates creeping up. And what's interesting is bond rates are also going up. And I want to mention something here that will be a theme when we talk about the city's capitalization rates. When an investor makes an investment into real estate is a riskier investment than a 5 or 10-year bond. A 10-year bond, you invest your money, you get your return. There's very little risk. But with real estate, you have liquidity issues, you have risk, you have management, you have all these other factors. So that the capitalization rates for real estate are almost universally going to be higher than your, let's call it risk-free bond rate. And you can see on page 8 that the bond rates themselves are upwards of 3.5%. The borrowing rates are over 5, closer to 6%. Which is very different than the years preceding. So one has to step back and say, does it make sense that a capitalization rate for an apartment building would be at or lower than a risk-free bond rate? And to us, that's a red flag. That means something is strange in that calculation. But I'll come back to that when we discuss the cap rates individually. Madam Chair, you asked a question about what factors we look at in capitalization rate, and I talked about the overall umbrella factors, but there are many, many factors to consider about the site-specific asset. Building type and construction, heritage status can also affect capitalization rate. Building amenities, the greater amount of amenities might be perceived to the market as being beneficial. Of course, with walk-ups, we're looking at really nothing for amenities. Durability and quality of income, age, major factor. The more age life you have in the asset, the lower the rate of return typically is. Condition, parking. Do we have a 1-to-1 ratio for suites to stalls? And in this case, we don't. Suite mix. Do we have an optimal suite mix? For this area, I wouldn't say 1 bedroom is not optimal, so that's fine. And the number of suites. And the number of suites is one that, we've talked a lot about on our side. Is there any evidence that a property that is smaller in number of units is going to have a lower capitalization rate? And we see no evidence of that. But what we do see is that, any statistic can be skewed by the inputs. And what we find is that there is a prevalence lately in the inner city of very small number of units in newer properties. So what may be happening is that the examination of these sales and a lower cap rate is confused to be the reason for the lower cap rate is because of the suite count rather than the newer age of the property. The point being is we don't see the evidence. The evidence isn't in place from either the city or Altus groups. So, and then of course, location and external factors. So our starting point after we look at these points, or not starting point, I guess step 2 is let's see what the brokers are saying. Now, we use that with a large grain of salt because these are marketing reports. And also, when we look at cap rates, we need to understand what the inputs are. How are you applying the revenue and the expenses, and is it consistent? Is it consistent with your methodology for valuing the subject property? That's a key appraisal point. And that's why when somebody says, well, here's a subset of cap rates and they're X, Y, and Z, and we said, well, how did you calculate them? We're cautious about just taking something at face value because you can ask 5 appraisers to calculate a cap rate on a sale, and you might likely come up with 6 different opinions, depending on how people stabilize the income. So the key is you need to make sure that you're transparent in your methodology. And so the inputs are going to vary, right? In some cases, you may have 3 years of stabilized income and you're able to do that. In other cases, you have to look to 1 year, or you have to look to the pro forma that was given in the sale. Whatever it is, though, is a starting point that you can use to still treat things in a uniform fashion. And we also have to make sure that the sales are arm's length, not untypically motivated. There's a lot of factors that when we look at a subset of sales that we have to say, well, we can't look at that one, we can't look at that one, we can't look at that. And the city would do the same thing. Altus Group had come down with 5 sales that are shown on page 12 for capitalization rates. And again, the methodology, while it's consistent with the overall methodology, the sources of the inputs may differ. In some cases, it's pro forma. In some cases, it's stabilized income. In some cases, we look to stabilize income. And then we realize through investigation or an interview with the purchaser that the purchaser knew that there was an increase in revenue coming because of improvements to the property. And they've applied to the RTB, and perhaps they had a favorable decision already. So again, we have to get into the mind of the purchaser. What are you buying at the time of sale? And so we've looked at these 5 sales with that sort of background, and we have cap rates from our conclusions that range from 5.42% to a high for a very inferior property on Maryland of 7.11%. What that basically does, there's a higher end there that I'd question, but generally the conclusions, which hover around the 5.5 to 6%, are coincidentally rather consistent with what the brokers are saying for low-rise properties. And then we count that the subject is an older property, and we've got the stall to suite count ratio that's a little lower, et cetera, et cetera. So our conclusions are we're probably looking at something between 5.5 and 6% for the subject. I won't go into much more detail, Madam Chair. It's a very lengthy document that our team put together, but it's basically all the background information on how we determine these capitalization rates. So I'll just pause there, and I'll come now back to our direct presentation, if I may.
Okay.
Thank you. So on page 13, we summarize, based on our studies and corroborating with the broker reports, what our conclusions are just based on age. And the 1962 category would fall in the second column there, or second row, sorry, with a range of 5.75 to 6.5%. I think the 6.5 might be stretching it a bit, but I assume what they meant by that is you might have a property in an inferior location or other factors. But generally, I'd suggest the 575 to 6 is probably our base. We don't adjust for age because we already accounted for that. I don't think there's anything to adjust for with building type or construction. It's a good concrete block construction. Building amenities, I'm not going to add anything to the capitalization rate because this is the amount of amenities, 0, is consistent with a lot of properties in its age group. Durability and quality of income, average. Condition, average. Parking, well, that is a concern, but to be fair, it is Cordon Village. You know, a lot of people may walk to in the area, but still, I mean, an investor typically wants to see 1 stall per suite, so it is a bit of a concern. Suite mix, I mean, we only have 1 bedroom. I'm not making an adjustment for that, but it's only 1 bedrooms. Suite sizes are average. Location, I think Cordon and River and those areas. Sorry, this is Osborne Village, not Cordon, but I basically lump those into the same, which is they're good areas generally. I think they're having some problems in recent years, but we make an adjustment for that. In this case, I've adjusted downwards of 10 basis points. And so what we have then is a 5.75 base. We have an adjustment for location, and we come to a conclusion of 5.65%. Do we feel that is reasonable based on the cap rates we've studied? Certainly. Do we feel it's reasonable based on what the broker reports are stating? Yes. On page 15 then, I've talked about our calculation of the net income. It is higher than the city. We come in at 61,948. We apply a capitalization rate of 5.65%, and that brings us to an overall value of $1,096,000. It's just approximately $100,000 per suite. Again, I feel that's a reasonable valuation. And I think that completes our presentation, Madam Chair and panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Assessor, do you have questions for Mr. Slaughter?
Would you agree that typically most apartment residents may not necessarily have a vehicle?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. But again, I think any investor, if I was buying a property, I typically would like to see a 1-to-1 ratio.
Okay. No further questions.
Thank you. Ms. Werhan, questions for Mr. Slaughter?
I do not, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
Just one on your page 15. You say you stabilized your expenses, and just one jumped out at me is your line 23. Like 15,696 isn't a stabilized number. That's the high number of 2022.
Oh, yes. So, sorry, I should have specified. When we say stabilized, there's 2 methods we use. One is that we use the last year before the reference date. So for revenue, for example, revenue is not going down, right? So there's no point in stabilizing revenue. And then utilities as well. We know it's not going down. I think insurance is another one. But some of them vary year to year, and it not necessarily is always appreciating. So those ones we actually average for our stabilization. Those are, management fee is an automatic amount, professional fees, repair and maintenance, advertising. Those are the items where we look at historical and do an average instead. So I apologize. The word stabilization may imply an average, but what we do is we have 2 different methods depending on the line item.
Okay, that's all I had.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, I'm just going back to your cap rate page on page 13. And you do have the range. I see that. And does Altus always stick to, maybe that's not very nice words, but to the effective year built? Is there any deviation? I mean, there is obviously deviation based on site specific. I see that. But sometimes the city's not kept up with their effective years. So it might be a really great apartment built in 1962, so it would fall into 5.75, but really it's not a 1962. So do you ever do that, or do you always just start with the base and then adjust based on that site specific?
I'm going to caution myself for answering for all 10 consultants at Altus and all the properties, depending on, how it's approached. But the answer to your question from an appraisal standpoint is yes. I mean, we're simply using age as a starting point. And then theoretically, there should be adjustments, which could be upwards or downwards. You see, in this case, I've gone downwards, right? But certainly I may adjust upwards as well. Now, effective age is a tricky one because there are times I've seen properties of a 1913 age that all of a sudden the effective age is 1993. I'm not certain about how that's calculated. And conversely, to your point, you may have a property that's undergone significant capital improvements in recent years. And so to say that the effective age is the original might not be appropriate. So to answer your question, Madam Chair, and I think there is an example in this presentation of another property where something like roof repairs recently, which we define strictly as capital rather than R&M, and then I make an adjustment downwards because we're not capturing that in the base year. So the answer is the proper technique is to look at what has happened. Do you think that actually will affect the age life to the investor? And if the answer is yes, you should make an adjustment.
Okay. And you did make an adjustment of 10 basis points. Why 10? Why not 25? Why not? Is this one of those 6 appraisers, 7 different ways things, or is it? I'm just asking.
It is honestly very subjective, but I mean, when we look at walk-up properties, if it was in, I don't want to pick on certain areas, but if it was in an area that we had concern with, we'd make an upward adjustment. But I'm cautious to make too much of a downward adjustment because a lot of the properties in this age group would be in similar type areas. Typically walk-ups are in areas with a lot of surrounding amenities. I shouldn't say that universally, but that's kind of my thought. And so, you think, okay, well, subjectively, and yes, definitely subjective. There's no quantification to this whatsoever. But would I suggest that Corden is a good area? I mean, certainly 10 years ago, yes. And now I'd say, yeah, it's a decent area. But am I going to adjust at 25 basis points? That's rather aggressive. When I know that there is a property on Corden that I think is actually a superior property, it's an older sale, but that was at 5.74%. So the answer is it's subjective.
Okay, fair enough. All right, that's all my questions, Mr. Slaughter. So you indicated you do have rebuttal?
Yes, Altus has prepared rebuttal to the city's capitalization rates.
Okay,
And
let's just take.
The rebuttal has been shared on the SharePoint. You can refresh your SharePoint and it will be there. And it has been shared with the assessor as well. So can you please confirm, Ms. Assessor, that you've received it?
Just give me a second here.
And panel members, it is in there.
SharePoint, yes.
Correct, I've received it.
Okay, is everybody ready then to begin with the rebuttal?
I'm still downloading it. Oh, I got it. Yep.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Slaughter.
Thanks. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'm not the author of this, so I have to catch up on it too. And I think the panel has probably heard a lot of this before. But page 2. So we have the summary here of what the city has shown, which frankly is showing a much more aggressive or optimistic conclusion on cap rates than what even the brokers are stating in marketing reports. So that's a bit of a flag. Secondly, that we don't know how the NOIs were calculated. Well, that's a bit of a flag too. And then when we take into account what I mentioned about bond rates, risk-free bond rates, and the natural spread that you will find between a risk-free bond rate and real estate, it's usually 100, 200, 300 basis points. That's typical. Well, not even 100, 200 to 300. When you see cap rates for apartments of this age under even 4.5%, I think some caution is required. So the very first sale, 727 Sargent, it's a 1955 walk-up, and the city is calculating a 3.46%, but we don't know how. I pause by saying, that raises a flag to me. 459 Sargent is a property that we've examined as well. Sorry, Madam Chair, I just have to navigate here for a moment. The MLS listing of this property showed an annual gross income of $101,142, monthly rent of about $740 per unit, and a parking income of $40 per stall. the purchaser would have based their purchase price on the income stream that they would have known at the time of sale, which is different than what we think has been used perhaps as a historical. Again, if we don't know exactly what the inputs are, it's hard to really understand why we have deviation. But we do. When we look at the income known to the purchaser at the time of sale, we calculate something much higher, 5.79%. Hendon, the third comparison. I'm going to summarize these sales, Madam Chair, into one category. 150 Hendon, 2390 McPhillips, and 700 St. Mary's. Each of these properties under investigation had been either sold at below market rents or subject to a imminent increase in rents because of work done and approved by the RTB as applicable for rent increases. So these are cases where if we look just to, the history leading up to the sale, but we don't recognize that in between that, before the sale, there was improvements done to request increase of rents from the RTB, that's really what the investor would be looking at. So as an example, if you could please turn to page 23. We talk about 700 St. Mary's, and we actually know the property manager. So Mr. DuPont of our team reached out to the property manager and said, what was happening in the sale? And they say clearly in the letter, the owner purchased 700 St. Mary's with the intention of renovating as the building was in rough shape and the previous owner had done nothing for repair quite a while. He's done some renovations to the common areas and plans to do more, but COVID has prevented him at the time. So with that background, we have to understand that the historical income is not likely what the purchaser is intending in their purchase. The sale right in the middle, 677 Maryland, that is shared between our evidence. We have it in our evidence as well. But the sale that we refer to is the most recent to the reference date. I believe it was 2022. And this was a preceding sale in 2020. And to give you a sense of what was happening with this property, the sale price basically went down $200,000 with three subsequent sales. In 2018, I think it was 2.2, and then or 2.6, sorry, and then 2.4, and that's the one that the city has. But then in our evidence, you'll see it was actually 2.2, closer to the reference date. So we would suggest that we should be looking at the more recent sale. And I think our conclusion on that was 7.11%. And when we take into account those ones, and there's some other minor points, but I'm going to pause there, Madam Chair, because when we take those ones that are low and we say, is there something about these that make us think that something is maybe off in the calculation, and we find in every case that yes, there is, and then we're left with the remainder, we would have a range that appears to be, let's see, we have 5.65, 5.59, 5.02. Oh, we did have comment on that one though, and then 5.74%. Sorry, let me just investigate 32 Arden. I think there was a comment on that one. Not that I see. Okay. Now, I mentioned something that when we look at sales that we have an indication that the income is below market or there's been renovations or RTB approvals in place, we need to recognize a different income than historical. This isn't just our opinion. This has been advanced through the municipal board numerous times, actually. And I'd like to direct the panel, please, to page 32. So this is a municipal board order from a number of years ago, 2018, where Altus Group was arguing in this case that when you look at the subset of capitalization rates, you have to understand that some of these are either purchased for renovation renovation to increase the rents, or at that time, what was very common was renovation to convert to condominiums. And so it's not the income in place or historical income that the purchaser is buying. So we need to treat those differently. That was the opinion of Altus Group. These purchasers do not have the typical motivations, and a cap rate calculation is likely lower as it does not consider the post-renovation income model for a return on the total investment. The conclusion of the board to that hypothesis on page 34 was, the board is compelled to accept the evidence put forward by the appellate. Mr. DuPont's cap rate study supports the appellant's position, and this is further supported by the Collier's International Capitalization Rate reports. So again, they're kind of, they're listening to the evidence before them, and they're looking back to the marketing reports too, and saying, do the two corroborate? The point is, there are cap rates in the city's study that we find are should be treated with caution. And that concludes our rebuttal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Slaughter. Ms. Adarhanova, questions on the rebuttal?
No questions on the rebuttal, but I also have a rebuttal to present.
Okay, so we'll deal with your rebuttal after we deal with questions. Mr. Arnell, questions on the rebuttal?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Werhan.
None, thank you.
Okay, and I have no questions either. So go ahead, Ms. Assessor. Let's make sure we have it first.
Just give me one moment, please.
Thank you.
Okay, I've shared the rebuttal on SharePoint to panel members and via email to Mr. Applicant. Can you please check if you received it?
Not yet, but I do have a copy, which I assume is,
It should
Madam
be the
Assessor,
same.
has the evidence changed in the rebuttal from
I
the
don't
city,
think
or
so.
is it? Okay,
I think
I
it's
think I have it here
consistent.
anyway. Yeah.
So
And
if
panel members, do you have it as well?
Not yet. I'm good.
All right, go ahead, Ms. Assessor.
the City of Winnipeg rebuttal to Alta's 2025 cap rate sale analysis on the page 12 minus the 150 Hendon for the applicant's submission. We see 345 Talbot, 677 Maryland, 738 St. Mary's, 100 Maryland, and 2390 McPhillips Street as discussion points. And for sales 1 to 3, 1 year of income and expense information is insufficient to calculate a stabilized net operating income and is unusable. Sale 4, no actual income and expenses involved in the calculation of the net operating income and therefore is also unusable. Sale 5, the potential gross income utilized by Altus is not based on historically reported information and is either incorrectly stabilized. So going to page 2 for 345 Talbot Avenue, it's our conclusion that the stabilization here is unusable as 1 year of income and expense information is insufficient information for determining a cap rate. We typically use 3 years. Alta's calculation average rent levels are inconsistent with rents reported in the prior year. Then on page 3, we can see the expenses and income for that one. Page 4, 677 Maryland Street. Here, there is only 1 year of income and expense information as well and is insufficient information for determining a cap rate. And the Altus calculation of average rent levels are inconsistent with rents reported in the prior year, as we can see on page 5. To page 6, 738 St. Mary's Road. 1 year of income and expense information is insufficient information for determining a cap rate. The Altus calculation of average rent levels are inconsistent with rents reported in the prior year. We can see that on page 7. And 8. Going to page 9 for 100 Maryland Street. We don't actually have any actual data here, so in our opinion, that would be an unusable stabilization. to page 10 for 2390 McPhillips Street. The Altus calculation of average rent levels are inconsistent with rents reported in the prior year, which we can see on page 11. That would conclude our rebuttal. And I would ask that it be carried forward for any further cap rate disagreements.
Thank you very much. Mr. Slaughter, questions on the city's rebuttal?
Not necessarily questions, Madam Chair, but I'd like to make comments, so I don't know what the appropriate time would be for that.
Well, you can make it in a summation statement.
Yeah,
point.
I think I'll do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Werhan, questions on the city's rebuttal evidence?
I do not, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
Not at this time, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I have no questions on the rebuttal. Ms. Assessor, would you like to make a summary statement?
I think I'm good, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter?
Thank you. So in comment, I'll start with the city's rebuttal. And to be fair, I think they're all fair comments. But it supports two things I said at the beginning. Number one, ask a number of appraisers or valuators what their opinion on a cap rate is, and you're probably going to get different opinions. But number two is you have to expose how you got there. So if you have different opinions, well, how did you get there? And Altus Group is trying to be transparent at all times. We don't always have all the information. We don't have, if we don't represent the property, it's hard to obtain 3 years stabilized information. But that doesn't preclude anybody from trying to get an opinion of what the capitalization rate was on a transaction. You just have to do your homework. And so we've exposed our rationale for every single cap rate in our study. And in cases where we don't have a stabilized 3-year, we try and obtain what we have. We look to what was being marketed at the time, so we get a sense of what the actual rental rates were. We test every expense item to market, every single one. We make sure that the rental income that we're applying based on what is known at the time of sale is in keeping with the market evidence. It's all here. There is discrepancy. Well, I mentioned two that each of the city and we have in evidence, and we have different opinions. One I mentioned was Maryland. They have an older sale. We have the more recent sale. I think that's pretty clear cut. And the other is 2390 McPhillips. And I admit this one's pretty murky. The city says it's a 4.71. I think you calculate based on the actual income. It's a 4.79%, but it's a 2015 apartment, right? I mean, that's kind of making sense. If a walk-up is, or sorry, if a brand new apartment in 2015 is 4.75%, well, walk-up's going to be a heck of a lot higher than that. But we say, no, actually, it's not even 4.75% because the marketing materials at the time show that the rents were escalating. The investor knew that was below market rents historically being reported. And we have that in evidence here. So this really comes down to an opinion. And we calculated at 5.59%. That might be a bit aggressive. I think the answer is somewhere between the two. It does not in any way contradict our conclusions on the cap rate for the subject. Those are my only comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Slaughter. Okay, then that will now conclude item number 5. Now, just confirming that the rebuttal evidence that you've both presented, you would like that to apply to all remaining items on the docket?
Correct.
Okay, so we won't need to go through it again unless there's something different you'd like to raise. Okay. All right, let's move on then to item number 6. This is file number 24-2187112 River Avenue. Ms. Edarhanova.
File number is 24-2187. Roll number is 120319572000. This is 112 River Avenue. Owner is 575-1111 Manitoba Limited. Roll year is 2025 with the reference date being April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is $1,230,000. This is Res 2 taxable. The apartment has one building on site, which is 2 stories. And here the actual year built and effective year built are both 1961. The number of suites is 11. And we have a parking count of 8. Going to page 3, we can see here that similar to the previous property, this one is also 11 one-bedrooms. The average monthly rent per unit is $908.68. And here, I think this is primarily as well a cap rate issue. I looked at the applicant's evidence. I think we're pretty similar on the NOI. So I'll just read the NOI. And so the net operating income here is 59,633, and the cap rate here applied is 4.85%, model driven. And that brings us to our estimated market value of 1,230,000, and the market value per suite is 111,818. Going to page 4, we have our comparable tables. And we can see here that all our apartments, mixture of 2 and 3 story, the effective year built for the comparables ranges from 1955 to 1965, all have 1-bedroom units, and the subject's gross floor area per unit is 794 square feet, and the comparables range from 794 square feet, 778 square feet, to 851 square feet. The average monthly rent per unit ranges from $905 to $1,018. So we can see that the subject falls within the range. Going to page 5, we have our capitalization rate evidence. The following is a sample of actual sales that took place during the reference period. The purpose for showing these individual capitalization rates is to illustrate the accuracy of the model and substantiate the model-derived capitalization rates. They're not meant to be comparable specific to the subject property. The net operating income has been developed through stabilizing owner-reported income and expense information. Capitalization rates have been derived by dividing the property's net operating income by its sale price. Page 6, again, capitalization rate evidence. So we can see for the city of Winnipeg's 20th and 80th percentile within the multifamily, we have the 20th percentile as 4.75 and the 80th as 5.45 cap. Page 7 is the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. Page 8 shows an aerial of the subject property, as well as the map view, again, in a good location. Here we can also see online information as well as images for the subject property starting on page 9. So 112 River is a beautifully maintained 3-story apartment that features 1-bedroom suites with refinished hardwood, vinyl, wood flooring, modern ceiling fans, stainless steel appliances, including a dishwasher, new windows, blinds, and more. So it seems like there's been some capital expenditures invested. This pet-friendly apartment offers many great amenities for its residences, like available parking stalls, ensuite laundry, cycling program, and access to all major bus routes. Going to the mailer on page 11 for 2022, we can see here that the NOI comes in at $63,670, and the model was at $59,633. And page 12 shows the multifamily info for the potential GPI. So we can see here that the model is supported. That would conclude my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Slaughter, do you have any questions?
No questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Werhan, questions for the assessor?
I do not, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
None at this time, thanks.
Thanks. I have no questions either. So moving on to you, Mr. Slaughter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to keep this very quick. This is basically a sister property to the one we just discussed, I believe. So if you could please turn to page 16. The rents are a little bit less than the last property, but pretty much in keeping. We've stabilized actual rents. We've applied market vacancy. We stabilized, which either means the last year before the reference date or an average of 3 years, the expenses. And our NOI actually is slightly higher again than the city. We come in with an NOI of 60,981. So the only question really is what's the appropriate cap rate? I strongly suggest that anything sub 5, based on all the evidence we talked about, is far too optimistic. And we apply 5.65% for the same conclusions we had for the previous property. The indicated value, therefore, Madam Chair, is $1,079,000, and that completes our presentation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Slaughter. Ms. Adarhanova, questions?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you, and I have no questions either. So recognizing that there is the rebuttal evidence for both of these from both sides, we'll just make sure that's noted. And that will conclude item 6, unless Ms. Adarhanova, would you like to make a summary statement?
I guess to summarize would be that these smaller apartments with 11 units are more attainable for a larger pool of potential buyers.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter?
Just to ensure, Madam Chair, also the capitalization rate study from Altus Group, it would apply
Yes.
to each. Okay, thank you.
Yes, yes. Thank you. All right, that concludes item number 6 now. All right, we'll move to item number 7 on our agenda. This is file number 24-1401, 141 River Avenue. Ms. Adarhanova.
File number is 24-1401. Roll number is 120322890000. Address is 141 River Avenue. Owner is 4991509 Manitoba Limited. The roll year is 2025 with the reference date being April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is $1,359,000. This is Res 2 taxable. The apartment has 1 building on site, which is 3 stories. The actual year built is 1906, and the effective year built here is 1908. We have 11 suites here with 8 outdoor parking. Continuing to page 3, we can see here that the suite mix is 8 1-bedrooms and 2 2-bedrooms, and that the average monthly rent per unit is $1,016.18. Here we can see that the gross potential rent is $134,136 with a vacancy rate of 3.2%. The effective gross income is $129,844. The expense rate here is 48.18%, and the net operating income is $67,285. Here we have a capitalization rate of 4.95 applied. All is model driven. And the estimated market value is $1,359,000. The market value per suite is $123,545. Looking at page 4, we have our rent comparables. So we can see that all our apartments all have 3 stories and 1 building on site. The effective year built here ranges from, for the comparables, from 1912 to 1927. And the suite mix primarily consists of 1-bedrooms, except for comparable 4, which has more 2-bedrooms than 1-bedrooms. And then for the first 3 comparables, they have less 2-bedrooms, and comparable 1 actually has some bachelor suites as well. So looking at the gross floor area per unit for the subject, it is 1,078 square feet. And looking at the comparables, it ranges from 942 square feet to 1,378 square feet. And we can see here that the average monthly rent for the comparables ranges from $915 to $1,093, which in my opinion, the subject falls within the range. And looking at comparables 3 and 4, we can notice that the heat and rent is not included. Going to page 5, we have our capitalization rate evidence. So the following is a sample of actual sales that took place during the reference period. The purpose for showing these individual capitalization rates is to illustrate the accuracy of the model and substantiate the model-derived capitalization rates. They're not meant to be comparable specific to the subject property. Net operating income has been developed through stabilizing owner-reported income and expense information. Capitalization rates have been derived by dividing the property's net operating income by its sale price. Here we can see the cap rate range from 3.46 to 5.74. Going to page 6, we have capitalization rate evidence as well. So for the city of Winnipeg multifamily, we can see here that we have in the 20th percentile cap of 4.75 and in the 80th percentile 5.45 cap. Page 7 is the Municipal Assessment Act excerpts. Page 8 shows the aerial view for the subject property, the purple rectangle box, and as well the location on a map, which is again near downtown, near Osborne Village. Good location. Page 9 shows some online information for the subject property. Located on the east end of River Avenue, this picturesque heritage building provides a quiet atmosphere and a convenient and sought-after location. Traditional architectural features such as original hardwood trim, hardwood flooring, high ceilings, and character balconies create the perfect atmosphere to call home. The neighborhood also offers many attractions nearby, such as Osborne Village, Manitoba Legislative Grounds, Safeway, Shoppers Drug Mart, the Forks, downtown. You can see the walking distance for Osborne Village and the other highlights, as well as the exterior image for the subject. So page 10 would be the 2022 multifamily information. So I looked at the average rent that would have been for the GPI, and it seems to come in at $932.27. And just to point out from on page 11's income and expense, we can see that there are some non-operating expenses included, such as depreciation, the finance charge, and I think that is what I've noticed. Also, the repairs and maintenance for an 11-unit apartment are extremely high in this case. Oh, there's also an interest line for 21 grand in the 22 that would also be considered non-operational expenditure. And then on page 12, the 2021 mailer is presented here, as well as page 13 shows the income and expense for that one as well. So we can see that the repair and maintenance here is high as well, and there's also some other line items that are non-operating expenses. Page 14 and 15 show the 2020 mailer. Again, with the high repair and maintenance and some other non-operational expenses. I'd say going back to page, oops, lost my page, page 3 for the model generated assessment, that our expense rate of 48.18% is supported because that's typically what is seen around the area. And it seems that the expenses for this apartment are managed at a higher operating cost. And going back to page 4, the model rent is supported by the comparables. That would conclude my presentation. Thank you. Open for questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Slaughter.
Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Adarkanova, for the presentation. I do have a few questions. Earlier, we were discussing properties in the general vicinity. They were mid-century walk-ups. The subject property was constructed in 1906, correct?
Correct.
And would you agree that an older property likely would incur higher repairs and maintenance and overall likely higher expenses?
I would agree, but I also think that just with the repairs and maintenance listed, that it wasn't listed as capital per se. So I would be inclined to think that it would be going to maintain the property, obviously, and just with the, I guess, the figures that we're seeing here, if that's the consistent trend, I wouldn't quite imagine the subject property to be run down. I'm not sure. I don't have any interior images. We have not inspected it recently, and we haven't seen any permits. But I'm not too sure that the interiors would be the standard of 1908.
That's an assumption, correct? You haven't inspected
That's an
the property?
assumption.
Yeah, okay.
But just going with the figures that we're seeing here for the repairs and maintenance, typically we see figures ranging between 1,000 to 1,800 or 2,000 typically for repair and maintenance.
2,000 per suite.
That would be on the high end. Typically, it's more so around the 1,500 mark.
Okay. Page 9, you referred to a marketing brochure. I assume this is a recent brochure, so it would reflect current condition, correct?
This is their online information.
Correct, yeah. And the brochure, it's a marketing brochure, let's be frank, but it doesn't mention anything about renovations or refurbished suites or anything of the such. It just, I think the words are, no, it doesn't mention anything about that. So there's no indication here that there's been any capital work or refinishing of the suites even to the current date, correct?
That's correct, and that's why our effective year reflects 1908.
Thanks. So I'd like to just ask a couple questions between pages 3 and 11. So if we could just kind of keep those two pages in mind. On page 3, you have a average monthly rent per unit of $1,016.18. And I think you mentioned in your presentation that when you calculated the average rent, it was more like $923 per suite. Is that correct?
932.
932. Oh, my dyslexia. Okay, thank you. And then further down that page, we have an effective gross income. So we erode the vacancy allowance from your potential income. And then we come to an effective gross income of $129,844. Now, if we turn to page 11, you'd agree that that is a fair amount higher than the actual reported effective income, which would include a vacancy deduction and it would include parking income if there is any, and laundry, of $116,956. You'd agree that's quite a delta.
It's not the same, no.
Okay. And you'd agree that earlier, I think you were mentioning that typically your investigation of actual performance supported the model, and you'd agree that typically when we found that performance was outpacing the model, we've made that adjustment. Would you agree?
So, sorry, just to make sure that I've captured the question properly. You're asking, I guess, on how you guys have been.
My question is, would you agree that it would be appropriate perhaps to question the model's conclusion when we look at the actual performance?
I don't think the model is unsupported, just given the comparable rents that we have provided.
So looking to market rather than site specifically, you feel that the model is okay?
In this case, yes.
And then when we come to the expenses, so on page 3, you mentioned that the expense ratio was 48.18%. And that totals an amount of $62,559. Now, we turn to page 11, and the total expenses are 157,207. But to be clear, you were exactly right. There are items that we would deduct. We don't include depreciation, we don't include finance charges, and it wouldn't include interest. But if you deduct those items, you'd agree with me that the expenses are still, I think, $125,000 approximately, which is, again, a very large delta from what is being applied. Would you agree?
I have not crunched those numbers, but what did you say? What was for the deductions?
I would
Just
deduct,
gonna jump back to
I'd agree with you to deduct depreciation, $8,300, finance, $4,000, and interest, $21,000. So you're looking at approximately $24,000 deduction from 157,000.
Okay. So yeah, going to my page 3, looking at the expense rate, I do think that the actual would be showing a higher expense rate, but I don't think the model is unsupported just due to the fact that 48.18 as an expense rate for the surrounding area is not unfounded, and that the effective age of 1908 is included in our model.
All the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Slaughter. Ms. Werhan, do you have questions for the assessor?
No, my concern was the cap rate, but I believe my questions were answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
No questions, thanks.
I have a question about the effective age. How does an effective age increase by 2 years?
I'm not entirely sure. It could just be. I don't think I have a good answer for you there.
Okay. My other question is,
I guess, not a big difference.
yeah, that's kind of what I was thinking. Okay, so in your previous properties, 1961 vintage, we have a cap rate of 4.85. So the model assigns this 4.95, a bump of 0.1, despite the fact that it's 50 years or so older, and looks like significant expenses and all those other things. So can you explain that to me?
I wouldn't be able to answer with specifics, but just from, I guess, what I notice is that the previous property had exclusively 1 bedrooms and that this one has some 2 and 3 bedrooms. I wouldn't know if that would be necessarily the biggest driving factor, but that's just a difference I noticed.
Okay, so is there an optimum suite mix?
I think that the larger suites typically are seen going for a higher monthly rent per unit than what we would have seen in, I guess, because 2 bedrooms are typically bigger than 1 bedrooms or potentially more desirable. I'm not sure if there's an optimal mix per se.
Okay. And looking at your comps, you say your rent is supported by your comps, but some of them have, significantly more. I'm looking at Arbuthnot, significantly more 2 bedrooms. Wouldn't that drive up the average rent?
That one, it would, yes. And that's also one where there's no heat in the rent included. So,
does our subject have heat in rent?
let's see the mailer. If they mention the subject does have the heat in rent.
So this is a question for my learning. If 2 properties are exactly the same suite mix, relative, kind of the same age, they're good comparables. One has heat in rent and one does not. What does that tell me?
What that would tell you would be that for like comparables 3 and 4, that there would have to be I guess, an additional cost for that heat and rent.
Okay, so they would be higher.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you very much for that. Mr. Slatter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, we've gone through the physical description of the property. This is a little different than we've been talking about so far. You can see that on page 6. It's an older property built in 1906. The suite mix is 8 one-bedrooms, 2 two-bedrooms, and 1 three-bedroom. And it has 8 outdoor stalls for 11 units. I think it's been clear thus far this afternoon that the approach taken from our side, from the owner's side, is that, and I commend the city, their model is usually quite good, and that we're finding on the NOI. Cap rate, we disagree, obviously, but the NOI has been quite good. And in fact, when we find that the performance of the subject property is outpacing the model, we've been making that adjustment upwards. But the same logic, same rationale should apply in the converse. And I think I can't explain why, but my hypothesis is that the model is for this area is tracking better for mid-century buildings, but not really recognizing the site-specific nuances of turn-of-the-century properties. And logic would dictate that properties that are older like this might not command as much rent, although of course suite mix will affect that, and certainly would likely have higher expenses. At the very least in repair and maintenance, likely insurance, likely utilities. It's going to have higher expenses. Those are the hypotheses. Then we test it. We're doing a site-specific analysis. And we've looked at the 3 years stabilized, and we have that on page 15. And in this case, we are quite different than what the city is applying. We have a effective gross income. So we've looked at the actual incomes in place at the closer to the reference year. We've deducted a market vacancy. We've added approximations for laundry and parking, and we come to a stabilized effective income of $121,184. Let me be clear, that is still higher than the actual, which was 116. But of course, the owner doesn't break out the components of the effective income. So I don't know if we're higher on the rent or too low on the vacancy. But the point is, the amount of effective income that the owner is attaining at 2022 is 116,000. We're using 121. So higher than actual, but lower than the city model. The biggest difference is in the expenses. So we've gone through the exact same exercise. We look at 3 years. In some cases, we use a standard market application. Like with management, the standard application is 5% of your effective income. In some cases, we use the closest date to the reference date for the reason that these expenses are likely not going down. So we use the last date. And in other cases, about half the cases, we use an average over 3 years. The exception in this case, twofold. Number one, wages and benefits. We feel that something is askew in the 2022 wages and benefits. They stand out at $24,393, and that's higher than the preceding 2 years. This is where we make a judgment call. Do we actually use average, or do we feel that something may be excessive in the 1 year? And we chose the latter conclusion. So we actually use 8,554, which is much more in keeping. That's 7% of the effective income, and we feel that's an appropriate adjustment. Again, indicating a higher value. The second adjustment we make, Madam Chair, is that the R&M is higher. I mean, the average is 52,600. We feel, and this is actually mentioned by the assessor, that the expense ratio can be as high as, typically it's 1,500, but when you have a turn-of-century building, it is not uncommon at all to have around 2,000 a suite. And that coincidentally is the exact number we used, 2,000 a suite. So we've made these rather drastic adjustments to the actual expenses, and we still come to a conclusion that is higher than the city. The city was sub 50%. That raises a flag off the top to me, and we're coming in at 60.8%. And while my specialty is not multi-residential, based on what I've seen historically, that seems more appropriate for this age of property. But more importantly, is corroborated by the actual evidence. So our effective income, when you have a lower actual revenue and a higher actual expenses, our income is a fair amount different than the city. We come in at $47,455. We have a chance. We try and do the best we can to examine R&M as a category. The assessor brought up a great point. When you're looking at the apartment valuation, or sorry, evaluations of apartments, there isn't a breakout of capital versus actual R&M like you would have for properties that are on a net basis, where the tenants need to know, hey, what were you spending that money on that we're recovering? The owner, it's all gross, so they need not do that calculation for these purposes. They would have to do it for CRA. So what we try and do is obtain the information, and our team goes through that and says, okay, this is capital, this is repair and maintenance, based on board's decisions in the past of what category they would fall under. In this case, unfortunately, the last year we had was 2018. So we have the total R&M, but we only have 2018 broken down. But we did see that there was a significant roof repair. I say significant, I mean in the percentage of the total R&M. And that's a capital improvement. So therefore, that's one of the main reasons, Madam Chair, why we weren't going to look at actual R&M, which was closer to 4,000 a unit. We said, what is a typical for this age of property? And we factored that down significantly to $2,000 per suite. So I won't go through the capitalization rate study. It's the exact same conclusions that we've had. If I can ask you to turn to page 13, please. The conclusions of our study is that based on effective age only, pre-1946 would be above 6%. That was the conclusions of our study. But Madam Chair, you asked a question earlier. Well, what if the effective age isn't right? And what if you find something about the property that you think warrants some kind of adjustment, whether it was an effective age, which would bump the category, or otherwise? And in my subjective opinion, we do have evidence of that. At least what we see from the size of the R&M total and the fact that the 1 year we can investigate indicates there was a roof repair. I'm going to assume that there are some capital expenditures that personally I think we should recognize if we're not recognizing a different effective year. Now, let's be careful here. This is a turn of the century building. It will definitely have higher expenses. We don't want to overemphasize this adjustment. But what I've done is adjust the cap rate down by 25 basis points, which I feel is actually pretty aggressive. Optimistic. And we also have the same adjustment for location at 10 basis points. So I bring our base cap rate, which was 6.1% according to age, down to 5.75%. Now let's pause a moment. What I've been talking about were mid-century buildings earlier, and we had 5.65% for those buildings. And this building, I'm saying that we should be higher than 5.65% by easily, but we've had a roof repair that we know of, and we have higher repair and maintenance. So I think a fair subjective adjustment is to only adjust it upwards from the other properties to 5.75%. Again, this is completely supported by the evidence in our capitalization rate study. I frankly think it's supported by the adjusted evidence in the city study, and it's also supported by what the brokers are saying. CBRE may be a little bit more optimistic than the other two, but on the whole, I think it's a supportable capitalization rate. Back to page 15, we apply the stabilized actual NOI of $47,455 with a 5.75% capitalization rate, and that indicates a value of $825,000. That concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Slaughter. Ms. Dorhanova, questions for Mr. Slaughter?
No questions, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Werhan?
None, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell?
Just one on your page 16. You don't have any info on 220 or 221 or 2021, 2020 in your expenses, your repair and maintenance. So you're just averaging 18 and 19?
Sorry, this is page 16, Mr. Arnell?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we try our best when we're doing our review period in the spring, trying to do the valuations of the properties. We'll ask owners for as much information as we can about R&M. A lot of times we don't get it. So in this case, we went historical and tried to look at what's happening in the property, and we looked at current condition of the property. Now, I think one of the telling things is typically in a marketing brochure, they will be sure to make sure you know if there's been significant improvements to the property. So what we see here is an average looking condition, a significant R&M, but with evidence that there was some roof repairs in 2018, and not a significant improvement overall to the property that's being marketed. we try and put that together to our conclusions. So that's what we try and do. If we're limited in the information, Mr. Arnell, we do our best to try and look at all factors to come to a reasonable conclusion.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have no questions either. So summary statement, Ms. Assessor?
No, thanks.
Mr. Slaughter?
Just simply that I think if we rely strictly on the model, I have a suspicion that the model might not be recognizing the site-specific characteristics of this property, i.e. the age, and I think we need to look at site-specific information.
Thank you very much, Mr. Slaughter.
Thank you.
All right, that will conclude item number 7.
Would a 5-minute recess be possible?
Absolutely. Thank you. So let's reconvene at 2:45. Does that work for you?
Great, thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to call our meeting back to order. We are now dealing with item number 8 on our agenda. This is file number 24-1487, 396 Stradbrook Avenue. And before you start, Ms. Assessor, I note that you have requested that the burden of proof be placed on the applicant for non-cooperation, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so if you could please then introduce the property and deal with that issue first, please.
Sounds good. So the file number is 24-1487. This is roll number 12031677000. Address is 396 Stradbrook Avenue. And the owner is Dad Holdings Inc. Roll year 2025, reference date April 1st, 2023. The assessed value is for $1,327,000. This is Res 2 taxable. So property description, this is an apartment. There is one building, 2 stories.
Ms. Assessor, could
Oh,
you
just go to the
non-co-op first, and then the process would be we would make a decision on that, and then the burden of proof may shift or not, depending on the board's decision.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
So recommendation, the assessor requests that the burden of proof be placed on the applicant for non-cooperation, section 53(3)(b) of the MAA, and if a reduction in assessment is ordered, that it follow section 54(3.2) of the Municipal Assessment Act. So going to page 8, we can see the tracking number for the date of June 30th, 2023. And we can see on page 10 the same tracking number for the request for the property sale and income and expense information.
Okay, and is that your evidence?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Slaughter, on the issue of the burden of proof.
Yeah, sorry, Madam Chair, just one moment.
Sure.
I don't know if this is a question. I guess the address that this was sent to for Dad Holdings, 20152 Donald Street. Are we certain that there hasn't been an adjustment to that address? Because I know they vacated that premise in 2021. This is a client of ours as well, and they had Infotech was his business, and they closed in 2021. The building's been 100% vacant since that time.
If we go to page 10, we can see here on the lower left-hand side, the address for 20152 Donald Street, right?
Mm.
And somehow, I guess, the owners are able to pay their tax bill. So it seems that if they're able to pay their tax bill, they're probably also able to respond to the income and expense inquiry as well, as that's the same address.
Yeah, at the top of page 10, though, too, it indicates that the owner pays by tip, correct?
Correct.
So it need not reach the owner for them to pay. Would that be a fair assumption?
That could be.
Yeah. I have no further questions. I'm not saying that the city's wrong, Madam Chair, but this really raises a flag to me because I was just at the building for an inspection recently. I represented it last cycle and this cycle. It's 100% vacant.
Okay.
The gentleman's name is Eugene, and he is not at that building. I mean, he comes in once in a while, I think, to make sure things are not falling apart, but he's not operating out of there. And so my question would be, are we sure he hasn't changed the mailing address?
Okay, thank you very much. Ms. Werhan, questions for the assessor?
No, mine were just answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell,
No questions, thanks.
I have a question. There appears to be a signature, is that correct?
That's correct.
So it would suggest to me that he did receive this, this request for the income and expense information.
That's
Yeah,
how I
actually-
would interpret it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Madam Chair, and that is Eugene, who signed. So I have no further questions.
Okay. Okay. A question for you though, Ms. Assessor. Has the address for service changed? Have you received a request for a service or address change?
I'm not entirely sure.
Okay. Okay, thank you. But notwithstanding that, there does appear to be a signature. So thank you. All right, the panel will go in camera and make its decision with respect to the assessor's request that the burden of proof be shifted to the applicant. So thank you very much. The panel has considered the assessor's request that the burden of proof be placed on the applicant for non-cooperation, and we are going to grant that request. So, Mr. Slaughter, that means that the burden of proof falls to you, and you may begin with your presentation, please. You're
Still on
muted.
mute.
Yeah, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much. Just give me one moment, if you may. I just want to check something.
Yes, of course.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
The property is 396 Stradbrook Avenue. So this is located also in the River Osborne area. It was constructed in 1961. It has a gross floor area of 8,778 square feet, which is inclusive of a just under 3,000 square foot lower level basement. So it's 2 stories with the lower, not including the lower level. There are 4 bachelor suites, 8 one-bedroom, and 1 two-bedroom. The site area is 7,358 square feet. If I could ask the board, please, to turn to page 6. We see an aerial photograph and the property picture. So a pretty standard mid-century walk-up, like the ones that we talked about earlier today. There are 5 outdoor parking spaces at the rear, so much ratio 5 versus 13 suites. If I could ask you, please, to turn ahead to page 12. The assessor applies a potential gross income of $129,472. Now, our original calculation, Madam Chair, was coming in very low. And actually, if I could ask you to turn to page 15, maybe I should start here. So we've done the stabilized approach to the revenue and expenses. But one of the things we found is 2021, we couldn't figure out why it jumped so high. You'll see that the revenue in 2021 goes from 111,000 to 167, and then down to 106. And that's potential income. And something seemed odd about that. And we couldn't get an answer in time. So what we did instead is look to the actual rents that the owner reports in the I&E form, which is on the third last page of our presentation. You'll see unit rents. And we went through those and we determined, or we ascertained what the rents were that they were achieving for the bachelor suites, the 1 bedroom and the 2 bedroom. And so that is what we conclude on page 12. That if we apply the rents for each of the types of units, we would have actually a potential income of 117,000, which is greater than what they're reporting. So we're not sure what happened there in the reporting. There might have been a change of year end, perhaps. I don't know, but I can't rely on the reported 2022 rents. I have to calculate it ourselves. So we have a higher potential income, and we would then deduct the vacancy allowance, and we'd add for parking and laundry. But on page 15, the next category that we look to is the expenses. And we go through the same exercise I described before, either taking the last year for the appropriate item or averaging over the 3 years, or applying a market rate. And we applied a market amount for repair and maintenance of $2,000 a suite because the actual R&M was far higher, but we didn't see any evidence of capital. In this case, we did look at the 21 and 22 on the subsequent page, and most of it appears to be regular repair and maintenance. So that seems odd as well, that it was so high. We lowered that down to 2,000 a unit. But still, we came out with an expense ratio which we felt was very high. So in conclusion, Madam Chair, because I don't have answers to some of these reasons why my expenses are higher and my income is lower than what the city's saying. So I've done something that we don't typically do, is I don't trust what I'm concluding, and I'm reverting and actually accepting what the city is using, despite the fact that it seems to be outpacing actual performance, because there's holes in my evidence for the actual performance. So long story short, we have no contention with the NOI that the city is applying of 64,382, and that's what we overrode in our stabilized NOI at the bottom of page 15. And so that leaves me with one conclusion. What is the appropriate capitalization rate? And I won't go through the evidence again, Madam Chair, but I feel quite strongly that we would, for this type of property, would be north of 5.5%. The conclusion I came to for the other mid-century apartments earlier was 5.65%. My original conclusion on this property was 5.75%. And I think it's because I didn't trust the fact I was using a market income that seemed to not be supported by the actual evidence, even though I wasn't sure about the actual evidence either. I'd like to revise that, Madam Chair, now, please, manually. To be consistent, I would ask the board to consider 5.65% as the capitalization rate. And that, again, is being applied to an uncontested net operating income of 64,382. And so the revised value, not what's shown on the paper here, but the revised value with that calculation is 1,139,500.
So
and again, that's
yeah,
sorry, yeah,
1,140,000 rounded.
Rounded, yes, yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Okay.
And I won't go through the cap rate evidence again, so that would conclude our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Slaughter. Ms. Darhanova, questions?
No questions.
Thank you. Mr. Arnell, questions?
So you're applying a 5.65 cap rate
That's correct.
on the 61 building and a 5.75 on a 1908 building?
That's correct. But just recall that in the conclusions of the 5.75, I would have been higher based on age, but I made a downward adjustment because there was indication, well, there was evidence that they had done capital improvements to the roof. So that was the differentiating factor. And that actually was tying into Madam Chair's question earlier today. What do you do if you think the effective age is not indicating the actual asset? And that's what we do.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Werhan?
None, thank you.
Thank you. And I have no questions either. So, Ms. Assessor, to you.
Okay, so considering that we're in agreement with the NOI, I think I will just present the cap rate evidence that we have. So jumping to page 5 for the capitalization rate evidence. The following is a sample of actual sales that took place during the reference period. The purpose for showing these individual capitalization rates is to illustrate the accuracy of the model and substantiate the model-derived capitalization rates. They are not meant to be comparable specific to the subject property. Net operating income has been developed through stabilizing owner-reported income and expense information capitalization rates have been derived by dividing the property's net operating income by its sale price. And I think just looking at our table, obviously the range is consistent to what we've seen before, 3.46 to 5.74, and our subject having a cap of 4.85. I feel it's appropriate just looking at the age of many of these, I guess, the year built within this table, it seems that it's well within its rights to be within that range. And going to page 6, we have more capitalization rate evidence. So looking at the multifamily city of Winnipeg, we can see here that it is also within the range of the 20th percentile to the 80th percentile. It's between 4.75 and 5.45. And in my opinion, that supports our cap rate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Slaughter, questions for the assessor?
No questions that I haven't already asked. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Arnell, questions?
No questions, thanks.
Thank you. Ms. Werhan?
None, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, would you like to make a summary statement?
Just simply that I think, despite the fact I don't have answers for all of the conclusions of the NOI, I think that the NOI, even though we're accepting it, may be on the high side based on what we're seeing on the reports. And I think the capitalization rate of 5.65, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, is well supported.
Thank you very much. Ms. Assessor, would you like to make a summary statement?
No, thank you.
Thank you. All right, then. That will conclude item number 8. And we have now heard all items on our agenda, and this hearing is now adjourned. So thank you very much, both of you, for your presentations today.
Have a
Have a
day,
good
bye.
rest of your day.
You too. Thanks.
Bye-bye.